Hey guys, I hope all is well. I got another build here for you today featuring Forceful Arrow. And the speed at which this thing killed Lilith really made me happy because it literally only took like 2 tries, which blew my mind because usually it takes a lot more tries for me to kill that goddamn glorified chicken. So I know that everyone and their mom is using Hearteeeker because it was made popular due to the victimized double dipping glitch, which made it so the game ran through the vulnerable damage multipliers to the victimized explosions 2 times instead of once, which unfairly caused it to do massive amounts of damage. However, Hearteeeker isn't the only basic ranged ability. As a matter of fact, although Hearteeeker can ricochet, which can increase the amount of victimized procs, I would argue that there is a better clear speed skill also capable of slaying all the tormented bosses, capable of doing tier 101 of the Pit of Artificer, and of course clipping the wings of Uber Lilith, and that skill is Forceful Arrow. So before I jump into the video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and please leave me some feedback and let me know what you think of the build. So the reason why I think Forceful Arrow is better than Hearteeeker is Forceful Arrow can pierce through packs of enemies, and with a bit of attack speed, it can pierce pretty reliably and comfortably. Hearteeeker can only hit 2 enemies at a time with Ricochet, and therefore can only proc 2 explosions from Victimize. However, Forceful Arrow can hit the entire pack, therefore can potentially cause as many explosions from Victimize as enemies it pierces, making it a better skill overall for clearing packs faster. With my Elixir of Advantage and affixes for my gear, I have 74% lucky hit chance with Forceful Arrow, which is certainly comfortable enough to be proccing victimized explosions pretty often. However, when it comes down to it, yes, I do like that Hearteeeker can auto-target, but it's honestly pretty inefficient and lazy when it comes to general gameplay. But I will give it the edge on bossing because for bossing, you don't really have a need for your arrows to pierce. So in those cases, having an auto-target skill is pretty useful. Other than that, my Forceful Arrow was able to slay each and every tormented boss with relative ease, was capable of clearing at least tier 100 in the pit, and absolutely destroyed Uber Lilith, as you'll see at the end of the video. But really quickly, let me just show you my gear aspects and jewels. For my helm, I am running Harlequins for the extra ranks to Forceful Arrow and the extra damage reduction. However, you could also just use a Godslayer, which will conveniently group all the enemies for your arrows to pierce through, or a regular helm with life, lucky hit, and cooldown reduction with Aspect of Might for the damage reduction as well. For my chest, I've got Concussive Strikes for extra DPS to daze enemies, and I've got life, res, +4 to Dark Shroud to further boost the damage reduction, which is very important, and it's tempered with more life and chance to freeze, and I've embedded it with rubies for increased max life. For my gloves, I've got Aspect of Elements, which gives a huge damage boost every 7 seconds, and it's also got life, vulnerable damage, and lucky hit chance tempered with more vulnerable damage and chance to stun on hit. For my legs, I've got Umbrous Aspect for Dark Shroud generation, and I've got life, res, +4 to Forceful Arrow, which is very important because it's literally the entire build, and it's tempered with armor and chance to stun, and I've embedded it with rubies for increased max life. For my boots, I've got Frostbitten Aspect, which causes my smoke grenades to freeze, which helps build stagger on bosses, and it's also got life, movement speed, and armor, and it's tempered with chance to stun and Dark Shroud movement speed for quality of life. For my amulet, I've got Adaptability Aspect, which more than doubles my Forceful Arrow damage, and I've also got crit chance, lucky hit chance, and lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable, and I tempered it with more vulnerable damage and dodge chance, and I've embedded it with a skull to help reach armor cap. For my first ring, I've got Trickster's Aspect, which causes my caltrops to drop stun grenades, which helps me survive and stagger bosses. It's also got vulnerable damage, lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable, and some res because I couldn't find a better ring, and I've tempered it with caltrop cooldown reduction and vulnerable damage, and I've embedded it with a diamond for all res. For my second ring, I've got Cursed Touch, which makes enemies vulnerable, and it's also got dex, attack speed, and lucky hit chance, and I've tempered it with more vulnerable damage and agility cooldown reduction, and I've embedded it with an amethyst for shadow res. For my two-handed, I'm using a bow instead of a crossbow because of the increased natural attack speed, plus the damage to distance enemies isn't that bad, and it's got Moonrise, which is huge because it gives me a massive boost in attack speed, multiplicative basic damage, and movement speed, which pretty much makes this aspect seem like a staple for basic damage builds, honestly. It's got dex, damage, and vulnerable damage, and I tempered it with more vulnerable damage and chance for Forceful Arrow to cast twice. And I've embedded it with sapphires for for increased vulnerable damage. For my main hand, I'm using a Dagger for damage to close enemies, with Retribution aspect for increased damage to stunned and knocked down enemies, and it's got life damage and vulnerable damage, and I've tempered it with more vulnerable damage and increased caltrop size, and it's got a Sapphire for more vulnerable damage. And lastly, for my offhand, I'm using another Dagger for damage to close enemies with Edgemaster's aspect, since we're pretty much always at max energy. It's just free damage, and I opted not to use aspect of Inner Calm because I'm not really a big fan of standing still too much, and my tendencies to move around would cause me to lose out on that extra damage. Aside from that, it's also got life damage and vulnerable damage, and I've tempered it with more vulnerable damage and some more increased caltrop size. So I definitely recommend not doing what I did, which was getting increased caltrop size on both my daggers. Instead, I would recommend getting increased duration on one of my daggers to significantly increase my damage, because having increased size on at least one dagger is definitely a nice quality of life improvement. It just helps you not have to worry about having the enemies or the boss stay within that caltrop range. And lastly, I've embedded it with a Sapphire for vulnerable damage. So for the skill tree, you just want to max out your Forceful Arrow and get primary Forceful Arrow for the piercing ability. And then you want to max out Sturdy and Siphoning Strikes, which is useful because more often than you would think, the enemies do get close to you, and it is helpful for you to be able to heal off of that. Then, of course, you come down, you get your caltrops into Discipline caltrops for extra crit chance against vulnerable enemies. And if you didn't have stun grenades on your caltrops, then you can also just get methodical caltrops for the cold damage and extra chill. And of course, you want to get rugged for the damage reduction from damage over time. And then weapon mastery is a staple. I like to go dash because that's just my play style. You can get shadow step if you'd prefer instead. And then of course concussive strikes for the extra crit, and I put 3 into trick attacks for the increased knockdown duration. And then over here, obviously Dark Shroud is a staple, and then I go into countering because of the extra crit chance. And then I do go concealment and smoke grenade into countering smoke grenade for the extra cooldown reduction, and then poison trap into enhanced for that knockdown. And then exploit is pretty staple, and so is malice. And then I get agile for the extra dodge chance, and I put a point into mending obscurity for the extra heals while I have concealment active. Down here you go frigid finesse because of the tempering on my gear, which allows me to freeze enemies, and it's just increased bonus damage against frozen enemies, which also does count against staggered bosses as well, which is huge. Then I got adrenaline rush, and then 3 points into haste for that extra movement speed. And lastly, we do go victimize with our 1700% increased bonus damage. For my Paragon board, on my starting board, I have Chip for the extra damage to physical damage. Then coming up here, I have Exploit Weakness for all of the vulnerable damage goodies, and I've socketed Fluidity for the extra damage after casting an agility skill. And then I kind of branch off into 2 boards here. The first one, I have No Witnesses, and where I socket Pride for the extra physical damage. And then down here, I have Cheap Shot for the extra damage to crowd-controlled enemies, where I socket Control for that extra bonus damage to crowd-controlled enemies. Then up here, I have Deadly Ambush, where I socket Exploit because it's a convenient place to get strength nodes while I pass to the next board, and it guarantees that my enemies become vulnerable. And of course I come down here just so I can get Spring Loaded for that trap cooldown reduction, which I can activate more often on bosses to help build a stagger bar. Then on my 6th board, I have Tricks of the Trade, which we don't really need to pick up. I really just come here for the Devious, for that extra damage and extra bonus to the magic nodes, which is damage to elites, and which is more armor to help reach the armor cap. And then lastly, I come down on my 7th board to Cunning Stratagem for the extra damage to basic abilities, and just so I can pick up some more resistances. So because of Harlequins, I do have an extra 32 to all stats. So because of that, I've opted not to get some of the extra intelligence nodes, which would have been boosted by my glyphs over there and over here as well, where there are some int nodes and some strength nodes. So if you didn't run Harlequins, then I would suggest picking up these stat nodes on the side, which are all boosted by the glyph. Alrighty, so here is the season finale Uber Lilith fight. I will admit the damage definitely surprised me, and it took me back to the good old days in the early seasons when she didn't have significantly more health like she did now. and where she died to me just as quickly as you see here, without having to take advantage of a double dipping glitch. But anyways, the fight is pretty short since the damage speaks for itself, so I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you guys next time.